It was a bright, sunny afternoon in the quiet town of Maplewood. People were going about their daily routines, and the streets seemed peaceful. Naomi Johnson, a tall, strong woman in her late 20s, was walking home from her office. She was about 6 months pregnant and carrying a small purse in her hand, looking forward to relaxing at home after a busy day. Naomi lived in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other. She was a well-respected woman, known for her kindness and intelligence. Little did she know that her day would soon take an unexpected turn. Officer James Turner, a man in his 40s, was patrolling the streets in his police car. He had been with the police department for years, but his reputation wasn't the best. Some people in the town knew that he wasn't the friendliest officer, especially when it came to certain people. Turner's approach to law enforcement was often harsh, and he had a habit of jumping to conclusions without knowing the full story. That afternoon, as he drove down the street, he noticed Naomi walking down the sidewalk. Without any clear reason, Turner pulled his car over and stopped right in front of Naomi. He rolled down the window and called out to her. "Hey, you. Come here," he ordered. Naomi looked at the officer, surprised by the sudden attention. She was used to seeing police cars in the neighborhood, but it was unusual for one to stop right in front of her like that. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked politely, trying to keep her voice calm and respectful. Turner's expression was stern as he stared at her. "You seem to be walking suspiciously. What are you doing out here?" he asked, his tone more accusatory than curious. Naomi raised an eyebrow, confused by the question. She was just walking home, carrying nothing but her purse and a few grocery bags. "I'm on my way home from work. I'm not doing anything wrong," she said firmly, but calmly. But instead of listening to Naomi's explanation, Turner took a step closer and asked again, "You're sure you're not involved in anything that's none of my business? You don't look like you belong around here." Naomi's eyes widened at his words. She had heard rumors about how Turner sometimes treated people differently because of their skin color, but she never thought she would face it herself. "Excuse me, officer?" Naomi asked, now feeling uncomfortable. "I'm just trying to get home. There's no reason for you to stop me." Turner didn't like being questioned. His face tightened, and he took another step closer to Naomi. "Don't tell me what I can and can't do," he snapped. "You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be." Naomi, still in shock, stood her ground. She had always been strong, and her patience was being tested. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said again, trying to stay calm. "I want to go home." Naomi had hoped the officer would realize his mistake, but that wasn't what happened. What followed next would change her life forever. The air felt thick as Naomi stood still, trying to make sense of what was happening. She had never been in a situation like this before. Officer Turner was acting aggressively, and his attitude only seemed to grow more hostile by the second. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest, and she knew she had to stay calm, especially for the sake of her unborn child. "I told you to stop," Turner barked, stepping even closer. His voice was sharp and demanding. "What's your problem? Are you trying to start something?" Naomi's instincts told her to back away, but she didn't want to appear afraid. She tried again to reason with him, hoping he would back down. "Officer, I'm not causing trouble. I'm just trying to get home. I haven't done anything wrong." But Turner wasn't listening. His face twisted with anger, and he looked at Naomi as if she had somehow disrespected him. There was no sign of understanding in his eyes, only a cold, dismissive glare. Naomi took a small step back, hoping to give him space and avoid making things worse. She had heard stories of officers who abused their power, but she never thought she would be in one of those stories herself. Then, without warning, Turner's hand shot out. He pushed Naomi hard in the shoulder, knocking her off balance. Naomi gasped, stumbling backward. For a moment, she thought she might fall, but she managed to catch herself. Her body trembled from the shock of being touched in such a forceful way, but she kept her feet steady. Naomi had never imagined that an encounter with a police officer would turn violent, But that was exactly what was happening. Turner's next move was swift and cruel. With no hesitation, he raised his arm and struck Naomi hard across the face. The force of the punch sent Naomi reeling. She felt a sharp pain in her cheek, and for a moment, everything went blurry. Her legs weakened, and she nearly collapsed onto the sidewalk. Naomi's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Her hand instinctively went to her face, feeling the warmth of the bruise that was starting to form. But she wasn't just in physical pain. She was shaken, heartbroken, and terrified. Why had he done this? Why had he felt the need to hurt her when all she had done was try to go home? Through the haze, Naomi could hear Turner muttering something, but his words were muffled in her ears. She felt dizzy, and she struggled to keep her balance. "You should have listened," Turner said with a cold tone. "Now you're going to regret it." But Naomi was stronger than he realized. She wasn't just going to let this man get away with what he had done. The shock of the attack surged through her, and she knew something had to change. She wasn't just a helpless victim. She was a woman with a purpose, and she wouldn't let Turner get away with treating her like this. With a slow but determined breath, Naomi straightened up. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. She was going to fight for justice. Naomi felt a mix of confusion and pain as she stood there on the sidewalk, her hand still pressed to her bruised cheek. She couldn't believe what had just happened. The attack from Officer Turner had left her shaken, but more than anything, it filled her with a deep sense of injustice. Why had he treated her this way? She had done nothing wrong. All she wanted was to walk home, like anyone else. Her vision was still a bit blurry, and her legs wobbled as she tried to stand tall. She knew she had to stay strong, especially for her baby. Naomi took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She was hurt, but she was determined not to let this moment define her. She was no stranger to challenges, and this one, no matter how difficult, would not break her. But Naomi wasn't the only one who knew something was wrong. A few people had witnessed the encounter from a distance. A couple of neighbors who had been walking nearby rushed over to her. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, a look of concern on his face. Naomi nodded, trying to hide the pain, but it was clear she was struggling. "I'm fine, just a little shaken up," she said, her voice steady, though her body felt weak. They helped her to a nearby bench, where Naomi sat down to rest. Her heart raced, and her mind spun. She couldn't just forget what had happened. The pain in her face was only the surface of what had been done to her. The emotional toll was much deeper. She tried to shake off the feeling of helplessness, but it wasn't easy. Her neighbor, a kind woman named Claire, looked at Naomi with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "That officer, he really hurt you," Claire said softly. Naomi sighed and looked at the ground, unsure of how to respond. "I don't know what got into him," she muttered, still in shock. "He didn't need to do that." As Naomi sat there, the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. She couldn't just let this go. She knew that if she didn't take action, nothing would change. Officer Turner's actions needed to be brought to light. No one should be treated the way she had been, especially not by someone who was supposed to protect and serve. Claire, who had seen Naomi at the local community meetings and knew her to be a strong, independent woman, offered her support. "You have to tell someone, Naomi. You can't let this slide," she urged. "This isn't just about what happened today. It's about making sure something like this doesn't happen to anyone else." Naomi nodded slowly. She knew Claire was right. The hurt from Turner's attack wasn't just personal. It was part of a larger issue. But Naomi wasn't one to back down. She had seen too many people in her life let things slide, and she had always fought for what was right. This time, though, the fight felt different. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for herself, for her baby, and for the truth. Before Naomi left to go to the hospital, she made a decision. She would file a report. She would not let Officer Turner get away with this. Her determination grew with every step she took. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was clear. She was not going to stay silent. As Naomi made her way to the hospital, her thoughts raced. Her cheek throbbed from the punch, but her mind was focused on something much bigger. She had made up her mind to take action, but there was one thing she hadn't told anyone. She wasn't just any woman. She was someone with a powerful role in the country's justice system. Naomi Johnson wasn't just a regular woman walking down the street. She was one of the most respected and feared judges in the nation. Over the years, Naomi had built a reputation as a sharp and no-nonsense judge. She had handled some of the most complex and high-profile cases in the country. Her decisions were respected, even by those who disagreed with her. People from all walks of life feared being on the wrong side of her in the courtroom. But despite her power in the legal world, Naomi kept a quiet and humble life outside of it. Most people in her community knew her as a kind woman, a mother-to-be, but they had no idea about her powerful career. As Naomi sat in the hospital waiting room, the weight of her decision to come forward began to sink in. She was about to reveal her true identity to the world. The doctor came to check on her, and she tried her best to remain calm. Naomi didn't want to make a scene, but her mind was already racing through what needed to happen next. The news quickly spread about the attack, and Naomi's identity was soon discovered by the public. It wasn't long before reporters began calling her phone, asking for interviews. Naomi felt the pressure of the spotlight on her, but she knew this was her moment. She had seen so many cases of injustice during her career, and now it was time for her to speak up and make a difference. In the courtroom, Naomi had always been known for her calm and fair approach. She made decisions based on the law, not her emotions. But this case was different. It wasn't just about the law. It was about standing up for herself and for every person who had ever been treated unfairly because of their race or gender. She was no longer just a judge. She was now a symbol of resistance. Naomi's colleagues, who had worked with her for years, were shocked when they learned about the attack. Many of them knew she had always been a strong woman, but they didn't know the full extent of her personal strength. She had kept her private life separate from her work, always focused on delivering justice. Now they saw her not just as a judge, but as someone fighting for justice in her own life. As Naomi prepared to take action, she realized how much her story could inspire others. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was standing up for all those who had been mistreated and hurt by people in power. The road ahead would be difficult, and the battle would not be easy, but Naomi was determined to make sure that what happened to her wouldn't happen to anyone else. Her journey had just begun, and she wasn't going to back down. The next few days were a blur for Naomi. Between the calls from reporters and the growing public attention, she had little time to rest. Every time she thought about the attack, a wave of anger and frustration would wash over her. But beneath all those feelings, there was a quiet determination. Naomi knew this wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger. Finally, the day arrived for Naomi to take the matter to court. She had filed a report, and the case was now in motion. The room was filled with tension as Naomi walked into the courtroom. It was the first time she had ever been in a case like this, one that was so personal. She felt the eyes of the room on her as she took her seat. On one side was Officer Turner, with his lawyer beside him. Looking calm and confident, Naomi could tell they thought this would be a quick and easy case for them. But Naomi wasn't going to let that happen. As the trial began, the judge called both sides to present their cases. Naomi sat quietly, listening closely as Officer Turner's lawyer tried to paint her as the one at fault. They claimed that she had been difficult and uncooperative during the encounter, making it seem as though Turner's actions were justified. Naomi felt a deep sense of frustration as she listened to the false claims, but she knew she had to stay calm. She had a plan. Then, when it was her turn to speak, Naomi stood up and made her way to the witness stand. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, but she didn't let it shake her. She knew what she had to do. With a steady voice, Naomi began her testimony. She spoke clearly, explaining exactly what had happened that day. She told the court about the unprovoked attack, about how she had been walking home, and how she had done nothing to deserve what had happened. But she didn't stop there. She knew the truth needed to come out, not just about the attack, but about who she was. Naomi paused for a moment, and then revealed something the courtroom hadn't expected. I am Judge Naomi Johnson. I've worked as a judge for over 10 years, handling cases in some of the most difficult courts in the country. I have dedicated my life to ensuring justice is served, not only in the courtroom, but in every corner of our society. The room fell silent. People stared in shock. They had no idea that the woman sitting before them was one of the most respected and feared judges in the country. Naomi had kept her career separate from her personal life, but now it was time for the world to know the truth. As she continued, Naomi spoke about her commitment to justice, about the many difficult cases she had presided over, and about the importance of holding people accountable, especially those in positions of power. She spoke with strength and confidence, and the courtroom was hanging on every word. Naomi didn't need to shout or get angry. Her presence in that room, her calm authority, spoke louder than anything else. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a judge, a symbol of justice, and she was ready to fight for what was right. The reaction was immediate. The judge and the jury looked at Naomi with a new level of respect. Officer Turner, who had been so sure of his position, now seemed uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. Naomi's revelation had changed everything. It wasn't just a case about an officer attacking a woman. It was now a case about power, accountability, and the fight for justice. Naomi had shown them who she really was, and she wasn't going to back down. The battle had only just begun. As Naomi sat in the witness stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The room was filled with a quiet tension. The judge and jury were paying close attention to her words, but Officer Turner, still sitting on the opposite side, refused to acknowledge the weight of her testimony. Instead, he shifted in his seat, his face hard and defensive. He wasn't ready to accept that things were not going the way he had expected. Turner's lawyer, a slick man named Mr. Phillips, stood up and began to speak. "Your Honor, we are asking the court to consider that this was nothing more than a misunderstanding. Officer Turner's actions were simply a reaction to what he perceived as a confrontation with the defendant." He turned to the jury, speaking with a calm but firm voice. He believed that Naomi Johnson, while walking down the street, was acting suspiciously. She refused to cooperate with him, and that led to this unfortunate situation. Naomi listened closely, her jaw tightening. She knew what they were trying to do. They were attempting to paint her as the troublemaker, the one who had caused the incident by not following the officer's orders. Turner's lawyer was trying to turn the story upside down, but Naomi wouldn't let them get away with it. Her heart was still heavy with the injustice she had faced, but she had the truth on her side. She took a deep breath and steadied herself. The courtroom was silent as Mr. Phillips continued his argument. He made it sound like Officer Turner had been the one caught in a difficult situation, forced to act out of fear and confusion. He even suggested that Naomi's refusal to cooperate had made things worse. The prosecutor, who had been quietly taking notes, now stood up to challenge this defense. "Your Honor, we cannot accept a defense based on false assumptions and excuses. We have heard the testimony of the victim, who has told us clearly that she was walking home and did nothing to provoke Officer Turner. We also have several witnesses who have confirmed her account of events. Officer Turner's actions were not justified." As the prosecutor spoke, Naomi's eyes shifted to Turner. He was staring ahead, his face a mask of denial. It was clear that he wasn't going to admit to anything. His arrogance and refusal to acknowledge his wrongdoing were evident. He still believed he could manipulate the situation, thinking that his badge and position would protect him from the consequences of his actions. Naomi wasn't surprised. She had seen this kind of behavior before, the way some people, especially those in positions of power, tried to cover up their mistakes. But this time, it was different. This time, Naomi wasn't going to let him get away with it. She knew the truth, and she wasn't backing down. The judge, who had been quietly listening to both sides, finally spoke up. "I believe we have heard enough for today. We will resume tomorrow to continue with the testimonies. This court will take into account everything that has been presented." As the court adjourned for the day, Naomi left the witness stand with her head held high. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she also knew that this was just one step toward making sure that justice would prevail. Officer Turner could deny it all he wanted, but the truth was coming out. Slowly but surely, things were shifting in Naomi's favor. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been mistreated by someone in power, and she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The days following the court hearing were filled with tension. The courtroom was becoming more packed with every session, and the media was beginning to pay more attention to the case. Naomi knew that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something bigger. People from all over were watching, and many of them had been inspired by her courage to stand up to a man in power. The courtroom had become a battleground for justice, and Naomi was determined to make sure that the truth would prevail. Naomi's legal team was working hard to build the case against Officer Turner. They gathered more evidence, talked to more witnesses, and pieced together the events of that fateful day. It became clear that Naomi's story was not just consistent. It was backed up by others who had witnessed the incident. People were starting to realize that what happened to her was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern of behavior that needed to be addressed. In the days leading up to the next court session, Naomi received support from unexpected places. People from her past, old friends, colleagues, and even strangers, reached out to her, telling her that they were proud of her for speaking out. Some shared stories of their own experiences with unfair treatment, and others expressed their gratitude for Naomi's bravery in bringing attention to a problem that had been hidden for too long. Naomi had always been a private person. She never sought attention or praise for her work as a judge. She had spent years quietly making tough decisions in the courtroom, always focusing on fairness and justice. But now, her quiet determination was becoming a symbol of hope for many. People were watching, and they believed that if Naomi could stand up for herself, they too could stand up for what was right. But not everyone was on Naomi's side. Officer Turner's supporters were still out there, and they were doing everything they could to discredit her. They tried to paint Naomi as someone who was just seeking revenge, someone who wanted to ruin Turner's career for her own benefit. But Naomi knew that their arguments were empty. The truth was on her side, and no amount of false accusations could change that. As the trial continued, Naomi felt the pressure mounting. The media was focused on her, and the public was waiting for the final verdict. But she didn't let the pressure shake her. She knew that this wasn't just about one man. It was about making sure that everyone was held accountable for their actions, no matter their position or power. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been mistreated, misunderstood, or ignored. Each day, Naomi entered the courtroom with more resolve. She could feel the weight of the case on her shoulders, but she also felt a sense of pride. This was her moment to make a difference, to stand up not only for herself, but for others who couldn't speak out. Naomi's quiet strength was becoming a beacon for justice, and with each passing day, she was getting closer to the truth. As the trial neared its conclusion, Naomi knew that the fight wasn't over. She had come this far, and she was ready to see it through to the end. She had made it clear that she wasn't backing down. And that was something no one could take away from her. As the trial reached its final stages, Naomi could feel the tension building in the courtroom. Every eye was on the judge, the lawyers, and the witnesses as they prepared to make their closing statements. Naomi had told her story, the evidence was clear, and the public was eagerly waiting for the verdict. It seemed like everything was falling into place for Naomi's fight for justice. But just when things seemed to be going in her favor, something unexpected happened that would change the course of the case. The courtroom doors opened, and in walked a man Naomi hadn't expected to see. Detective Marcus Thompson, a longtime colleague of Officer Turner. Naomi had known Detective Thompson for years. He was well respected in the department and had always seemed professional and trustworthy. But now, as he walked toward the stand, Naomi's heart sank. She had no idea what he was going to say, but she feared it might complicate everything. The defense lawyer, Mr. Phillips, quickly stood up and motioned to Detective Thompson. "Your Honor, we would like to call Detective Thompson to the stand. He has valuable information that may change the direction of this case." Naomi's eyes narrowed as Detective Thompson took the stand. He was calm, collected, and seemed prepared to speak in favor of Officer Turner. Naomi had no doubt that he had been called in to help protect Turner's reputation, but she couldn't help wondering if there was more to the story. The defense lawyer began asking Detective Thompson questions, trying to cast doubt on Naomi's version of events. "Detective, can you tell the court about Officer Turner's past record? Has he ever had issues with his behavior before?" Detective Thompson hesitated for a moment before answering. "Officer Turner has been a dedicated member of the police force. He's never had any major complaints filed against him. He's known for being tough on crime." Naomi felt a wave of frustration. She knew that Turner's past wasn't as clean as Detective Thompson was making it sound. But before she could fully process the situation, something surprising happened. The prosecutor, who had been quietly observing the testimony, stood up and asked to speak. "Your Honor, I request permission to introduce new evidence into the case," the prosecutor said. The judge looked surprised, but allowed the prosecutor to proceed. The prosecutor then presented a file, one that had not been introduced earlier in the trial. It was a collection of documents detailing Officer Turner's past actions, unreported incidents of misconduct, complaints from citizens, and even investigations that had been swept under the rug. These were things that Detective Thompson had known about, but had never mentioned before. The courtroom was stunned as the prosecutor read through the evidence. It became clear that Officer Turner had been hiding a pattern of behavior that showed he was far from the hero the defense had made him out to be. The revelation was shocking, and even Detective Thompson seemed uncomfortable as the prosecutor continued. Naomi felt a sense of relief wash over her as the truth began to unravel. This was the turning point she had been waiting for. The information that had been kept hidden for so long was now out in the open, and it was clear that Officer Turner was not the trustworthy officer everyone had believed him to be. For Naomi, this moment felt like justice was finally within reach. The tide had turned in her favor, and she knew that the case was now on the right path. But the fight wasn't over yet. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to stop now. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was filled with anticipation. Naomi sat quietly in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her thoughts focused on the moment that was about to unfold. She had come a long way since that fateful day when Officer Turner had attacked her, and now she was on the verge of seeing justice served. The judge, who had been presiding over the case with great attention, stood and called the room to order. "The time has come for the court to give its verdict. After careful consideration of the evidence, the testimonies, and the new revelations brought to light, it is clear that Officer Turner's actions were unjustifiable." Naomi's heart raced as the judge continued. "Officer Turner is found guilty of misconduct and abuse of power. His actions toward Ms. Naomi Johnson were not only an abuse of authority, but also a violation of the trust placed in him as a law enforcement officer." There was a moment of stunned silence in the courtroom as the words sank in. Naomi felt a wave of relief wash over her. The years of fighting for justice, the countless hours spent in the courtroom, the emotional toll, it had all led to this moment. She had won. Turner was held accountable for what he had done, and it felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The judge continued with the sentencing, making it clear that Officer Turner would lose his job and face further legal consequences for his actions. Naomi, though exhausted, stood up and left the courtroom with her head held high. She had fought for what was right, and the victory felt hard-earned. As Naomi stepped out into the bright sunlight, she was greeted by reporters, neighbors, and supporters who had been following the case. People gathered around her, congratulating her for her strength and courage. Naomi felt a deep sense of gratitude for the people who had supported her along the way. Without them, this journey would have been much harder. But for Naomi, the victory wasn't just personal. It was a victory for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for anyone who had felt powerless in the face of injustice. She had proven that even in the darkest moments, it was possible to stand up for what was right, to fight for justice, and to make a difference. Naomi's legacy would live on in the courtroom, in the lives of the people she had helped, and in the hearts of those who had been inspired by her story. She knew that her work wasn't over, that there was still much to be done. But for now, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, knowing that she had made a lasting impact. As Naomi walked away from the courthouse, a thought crossed her mind. This was just the beginning. She had always believed in the power of justice, and now more than ever, she was ready to continue her work. There would always be challenges, but Naomi knew one thing for certain. She would never stop fighting for what was right.